Hi, good morning. I'm really pleased to introduce Paul Taylor to give a keynote this morning. Paul is Professor of Psychology at the University of Lancaster and Professor of Human Interaction at the University of Twente. Is that how it's pronounced? I think. He's also Director of CREST, which is the UK's investment in behavioural and social science in the interest of national security, which I'm sure he'll talk about a little. So on his website, Paul describes his research interests as in how people cooperate. And looking through his extremely long CV, I can also tell you he's published over 70 papers in the field and is editor of Legal and Criminological Psychology. He has a Ministry of Defence Merit Award, a Metropolitan Police Commendation, and Best Conference Poster Award runner-up at the European Association of Personality Psychology in 2007.
Which I'm very proud of, thank you.
He is also the only professor of psychology I know whose team have a puppy called Bernard, which you can ask him about later. So I'm going to hand over to Paul, who's going to be talking about interpersonal sense-making in law enforcement.
I'm slightly worried this isn't on. Can you hear me okay? Good. Well, thank you very much. That was a rather kind introduction from Adam. That means he must be after something, which I'll probably find out later what that is. I think it's fair to describe my relationship with NDM as long-time listener, first-time caller. By which I mean I've paid a lot of attention to the NDM literature and read many of your works for many, many years, but have seldom had seldom taken the opportunity to come and talk to this audience, which means I've got a lot to say. So it's going to be a busy 45 minutes. 15 years ago to this month, actually, Brent Snook, Craig Burnell and I did an analysis of the literature on the types of decisions that security professionals and law enforcement professionals have to make as they go about their everyday tasks. What are the sorts of techniques and the methods that they're involved in, and how might that relate to something around decision and classification? And either ingeniously or foolishly, depending on how you look at it, I suspect the latter, we managed to squeeze it all into a 2x2 table, and that's what you're looking at here. In very broad and general terms, we felt that most of the decisions that were being made were of two different types. One was what we loosely called a grouping type of decision, where people are trying to allocate similarities and differences amongst cases, amongst people, amongst types of actions, and so on. And the other would be an ordering decision, where the goal of the sense-making, if you like, was not to group individuals, but it was to order them from best to worst, from most highest priority to lowest priority. Then there was also the way in which that decision was being made, and we classified that loosely into unsupervised and supervised. So unsupervised, as you will all know, would be the types of decision where an individual is basing on their own internal assumptions and thoughts and experiences, and supervised would be a type of decision where one uses an external validated tool, be that a kind of criteria-based tool which has been developed through practice, or a statistical method. And I'm showing you this as a start to this presentation because, for me, natural decision-making is everywhere in the law enforcement domain. So I've got some examples on this table just to illustrate the types of things where natural decision-making can really play an influential role in helping our understanding. So under the grouping unsupervised, obviously, our investigative officers have to make hypotheses about what the data in front of them is presenting. They build up stories and narratives about what's happening in front of them to try and tease out the sorts of inferences and the sorts of additional data that they must have to capture. They're in the process of explanation building. But they use those explanations to drive other types of unsupervised grouping decision, such as types of interventions, as types of disruption. Given the characteristic nature of this very fuzzy data, this very fuzzy set I've got in front of me in terms of behavioural details and crime details, what do I think, given my experience, is the best way in which to disrupt this criminal cell? Other types of decision that we see are what I would call a supervised more discriminatory decision. So linkage analysis is quite a large field now in psychology, where you're using techniques, statistical techniques, but also behavioural techniques to try and link together crimes committed by the same individual. Now, of course, that has a huge amount of decision-making underpinning it. And actually, one of the conflicts in the literature is between the clear ability that experts have versus the rather crude nature that some of the statistical algorithms bring to that same problem, and what's the difference between those two of those. Another example would be threat credibility. So a huge amount of threats are made every day against private and public sector individuals. How do I prioritise those? And what we would tend to do is use a formulaic criteria-based thing to help, criteria-based risk assessment tool to help manage that discrimination task. Finally, the types of decisions that fall under ordering are really prioritisation decisions. So they are about, I've got a huge caseload to deal with, how do I prioritise my resources? What are the key things to do here? How can I do that dynamically? Others, like insider threat mitigation, are really interesting examples because they've been moving from unsupervised to supervised over the generations. So in the early days, insider threat mitigation would be done by an expert decision maker, very experienced in security, looking for anomalies in a workforce, an individual, an employee's behaviour. These days, much of that can be done automatically using supervised or even unsupervised analytical scripts on people's digital behaviour in particular. And so on and so forth for the other areas. What's key here, I feel, is over the last 15 years since we produced this original table, we've seen a shift from the left-hand side to the right-hand side. And actually, if I'm honest, it's been a shift down, shift to the right and down. In other words, quite rightly in many ways, as technology has developed and as data has become more readily accessible, we have relied more on supervised methods for delivering our decisions. And as resources have become less and less, we've shifted down to the right. We've relied more on prioritisation than we have on discrimination. Now, that has left a huge gap in the top left-hand side there. And for me, that gap is very easily filled by naturalistic decision-making. So if I'm allowed one plug for CREST very quickly, if you remember nothing else, we're fortunate enough to be able to fund research every year. We've funded just shy of £1 million research over the last 2 years. Around 30% of our calls last year were about decision-making, and we really need some great proposals, and I suspect that the naturalistic decision-making community could help fill some of that space. So I want to talk about my own work in filling that space, and so I'm going to talk about something that I call interpersonal sense-making. So interpersonal sense-making for me is the dyadic process or the group process of really trying to understand the person that you're talking to iteratively over time, understanding, predicting and responding to the things that they're talking to you about so that you can encourage and gain cooperation. In many ways, I suppose this falls really at the periphery of what we might consider core NDM research, but I think there's some really interesting parallels here, some really interesting points of synergy and divergence here. And I want to talk to you really about the whole series of work that's in this area to give you a flavour for what's been kind of going on. Interpersonal sense-making is core to all of law enforcement. You can imagine a police officer on the street needing to engage the individual who's coming out of the pub after a few beers. But you can imagine the source handling environment where a police officer has to talk to an undercover agent and get them to cooperate with them where they may not want to do so. You can imagine the vetting environment where we vet individuals and ask them really about very personal details of their own lives to try and ascertain whether they're going to be a trustworthy individual for the security environment. That vetting officer has to gain cooperation and make sense of the individual very quickly, actually, in that type of interaction. But of all of the areas, my favourite is actually coined by the US military. They came up with the phrase, the good stranger, and I think that captures interpersonal sense-making perfectly. Their argument was that through extended tours in Afghanistan and Iraq, they'd noticed that some of their officers were very, very good at going into communities who were mistrustful, many antagonistic, and developing cooperation where others were less able to do so. And so their Good Stranger program really asked the question, what is it that those officers are doing that the rest can't? How are they making sense of the situation in front of them in a way that makes them quickly react and quickly act in ways that generates cooperation where the majority of our military officers aren't able to? That's the question that I'm really interested in. Now, psychologists have really been debating how this happens in what I've simplified here as a dichotomous route. We all agree that common ground is important. That comes from very old theories like communication, accommodation, and so on. When we get common ground, which loosely is understood as having a same understanding of the situation in front of you, when we have common ground, we know that cooperation ensues. That much we know. Where the debate for us arises, and I suspect it doesn't for this community, particularly after seeing Robert's presentation yesterday, is whether that common ground is derived from rule-based actions or simulation. So how I would understand simulation is that what I do as an individual when I'm making sense of you is I put my mind into your mind and simulate what you are feeling, thinking and trying to achieve, and then use that information to try and achieve common ground. For me, for our literature, rule-based actions are, I stay within my own mind and I see what's going on in front of me. I've seen this set of circumstances before. I heuristically make a decision that then leads to a common ground. And believe it or not, in the cognitive literature, which I'm most engaged with, this is a fierce debate. It's actually a very fundamental debate, of course, about whether we see the world through our own brain or whether we're allowed to we can move into other people's heads and see it from their perspective. From the naturalistic decision-making angle, and my personal view is, of course, both of these are important, yes? So this is what perhaps allows us to be more dynamic. This is what you build up as with expertise, with exposure, and so on. And indeed, that's, I think, what the evidence I'm about to present to you suggests. We need to take a bit of a segue, of course, into let's think about how we actually understand communication. How do people communicate? How do people put together dialogue? It's an incredibly complex process, dialogue, and yet we're able to do it while driving a car, while drinking a beer, some of us while driving a car and drinking a beer. And so it's clearly something that's very innate. And we spent a number of years really trying to understand what I would call the structure of communication. So we do this experimentally, but I think actually the best data comes from field data, where you can code the types of communication behaviours that people use, and look at the nature of those co-occurrences of behaviours across time, with an understanding that highly co-occurring communication behaviours must be on the whole, must be aimed at achieving some particular objective or particular goal. And so we would map them in space using something like smaller space analysis to try and look at the co-occurrences. Across a whole load of data sets, what we find is actually there's quite an elegant structure to communication, and it's defined by 3 dimensions. Firstly, when we communicate with other people, we tend to take one of 3 overall orientations to our communication. We either adopt an avoidance orientation, similar to flight, if you like. We adopt a competitive orientation, similar to fight. Or we adopt a cooperative orientation. Now, while we adopt one of those 3 orientations, when we communicate during particular periods, we tend to do so to pursue one of 3 motivational goals, what are often called motivational frames. Sometimes when we communicate, we focus on an instrumental frame. The primary purpose of the communication is to present information, to express desires, to express wants, to present data, and so on. So the principal frame of this talk is instrumental. Other times, though, when we communicate, the actual purpose of the messaging isn't really instrumental. It's about relational. It's about managing the interdependence and the trust and the affiliation between myself and the other person. So every now and again, you'll notice that I throw in a terrible joke. No one laughs at that. They never do. They do laugh. The purpose of that joke is not to present some instrumental fact to you. It's trying to engage the audience, trying to wake up the back rows again, and so on. The final way in which we communicate on occasion is around identity. So the principal motive for communication is actually either to support or defend my own identity or to manage the identity of the person in front of me. And what we see as we examine interactions across time is people move through those 9 different modes of interaction. So we adopt an overall orientation, either avoidant, competitive or cooperative, and we do so to pursue one of 3 motivational goals. And you can literally track people now, thanks to digital technology, as they move through this cylinder. The third dimension, which I'll just touch on very briefly, is intensity. What we find is when people are really intensely talking about something, then they tend to be very focused on one motivational frame. That's why it moves from the middle of the cylinder to the outside, the same way a pebble drops in the middle of a pond and moves outwards. When people are really highly intensely worried about something, they are not going to move motivational frame. So to give you a practical example of this, we train hostage negotiators. One of the things we train hostage negotiators to do is to offer food early on in the incident. There are many good reasons for that. Food can calm people down, it gives them sustenance and so on. It gives a dialogue talking point. So when you train new negotiators to do this, the dialogue often goes something like the following. Well, hello, Jack. I'm here, and I understand there's something that we need to talk about. But what I thought I'd do first is I'd get you in some food. We used to be able to pay for Chinese and Indian food, but these days, with cost-cutting measures, we're going for pizza. So I've got to ask you, what kind of pizza do you want? Do you want pepperoni? Oh, I like stuffed crust, because hostage negotiators are trained to talk. I like to hold on. This is the hostage taker. Hold on a minute. You're about to blow my head off. No, we'll deal with the guns in a minute, but let's just get the pizza order in. You know how bad they are at delivering in Bath. Pepperoni, oh, you're about to blow my... So, I won't carry on and I won't swear because I'm being recorded, I hear. Clearly, the pizza is a kind of instrumental relational type frame, but the person is desperately interested about the fact they might get shot. That's an identity frame, to give you the clue. And what happens in those situations, of course, is we see no progress. They just buttress against each other. So what have we found? So essentially, alignment in terms of the motivational frame, the identity, relational, instrumental frames, is associated with cooperation and is associated with conciliation in things like police interviews. Found it across a range of contexts, from hostage negotiations to police interviews to divorce mediations, many types of conflicts. It's about engaging at the frame level rather than the orientation level. So matching on frame is really important, matching on orientation not so much. So if you match on somebody's competitive orientation, unsurprisingly, it doesn't build your cooperation. Now, one of the things we've recently found in some research, actually, if you watch negotiators do what they do best, they often try and engage on orientation. And they want to do that because they want people to engage with the cooperation. So whenever they see someone talking to them, they desperately try and engage on cooperation. You see it in lab studies, you see it in field studies, and in particular, we see it in sequences. So for a very, very long time in the interpersonal sense-making field, we tended to rely on looking at the frequency with which people use their strategies. There's a real problem with that, because frequency doesn't necessarily indicate what's going to happen at the end. For example, if I had a set of relationship-building behaviours and a set of problem-solving behaviours, I could have 5 here outcome, or I could have 5 problem-solving, 5 relational outcome. I guarantee it would be a very good different outcome, but obviously the same sets of behaviours. But secondly, more crucially, the outcome of an interaction, many law enforcement interactions, is not really the end point. The outcome occurs at multiple stages during the interaction itself. So let's take a police interview for an example. Police are interested in gathering actionable intelligence. They don't wait until the end of the interview to collect all that intelligence. It comes up. The cooperation comes up throughout the interaction. And so a lot of our analyses have used something that's known as a proximity coefficient to understand the actions or behaviours or events which co-occur with the outcome variables of interest that occur within the sequence. So this is just a mock sequence of E up on the left-hand side here, and what you're seeing on the right-hand side there is the coefficient matrix from the proximity coefficients. Essentially, when a behaviour always occurs after another behaviour, you get a coefficient of 1. When the distance between two behaviours increases, so the coefficient drops. So what this allows you to do is understand what behaviours are co-occurring or are proximal to one another within a sequence. And that allows us to really understand the sorts of behaviours which are leading to the key behaviours of interest. It allows you to do two other things. Firstly, it allows you to actually get a map of an entire interaction or an entire decision process and compare them at that macro level in terms of the whole matrix. So you can compare the similarities of the matrix. So, for example, you can derive typologies of incident type from that type of methodology. And the other thing, of course, what you can do is introduce an independent variable where you're looking at the relative proximity across those. And we've done a lot of work looking at cultural differences in terms of those proximities and seeing how different cultures have different expectations around what follows what within an interaction.
It's just, there's all this.
I've been talking rather abstractly about sense making.
And sometimes it
I've
feels
got lots
like
of videos, but this one really hits the nail on the head.
And I can just feel it, like literally feel it in my head, and it's relentless. And I don't know if it's going to stop. I mean, that's the thing that scares me the most, is that I don't know if it's ever going to stop.
Well, you do have a nail in your head.
It is not about the nail.
Are you sure? Because, I mean, I'll bet if we got that out of there...
Stop trying to fix it.
No, I'm not trying to fix it. I'm just pointing out that maybe the nail is causing...
You always do this. You always try to fix things when what I really need is for you to just listen.
See, I don't think that is what you need. I think what you need is to get the nail
See, you're
out.
not even listening now.
Okay, fine. I will listen. Fine.
It's just... Sometimes it's like... There's this achy... I don't know what it is. And I'm not sleeping very well, and all my sweaters are snagged. I mean, all of them.
That sounds really hard.
Thank you. Ow!
Come on, if you would just...
Don't!
Keep on talking till I can go on. We can work it out. We can work it out.
So, one of the things we do with a lot of officers is try to get them to understand what their preferred frame is. I've heard it helps in relationships as well. I know I'm an instrumental person. Have a reflection on what you are. So, is there an expertise? You might be really interested. Is there an expertise in interpersonal sense making? In other words, what do good interpersonal sense makers do? Well, the way we can do this is we can compare those that have done interpersonal sense making tasks for a long period with those that haven't. We see that those who've done it for a long time are better at matching on average. They do more matching of the other person's frame. And actually what they do is they're more likely to switch their personal frame than are novices. In other words, they recognise the frame of the individual in front of them, the relational frame of the person with the nail in their head, and rather than ask them to take the nail out, they switch to a more relational frame to try and engage with them. Really interestingly, though, that switching we've found is time dependent and actually correlates very strongly with the type of training that's been given. So an example of this would be in the hostage negotiation world, you have training to develop rapport before you then go on to problem solve. And so you'll see much more switching in the early stages from instrumental to relational development and identity framing, which is more about rapport, and much more switching in the latter stages towards problem solving, because that's what their expectation is. But of all the findings that we've found across multiple data sets, it's this last one that I find intriguing. Successful expert negotiators and interviewers and others listen in what I would call transition periods. So if I analyse an interaction across time, there are times when we're in sync, when we're both talking in the same frame, we're getting on, we've got common ground. And then there are periods when we're out of sync, what we call the transition phases. The successful folks reduce the amount they talk by an average of about 40% during those transition phases. And then they re-engage by engaging at the right frame. And I call this getting your bokeh on. So bokeh is a term from photography, and it's essentially about, and many of you probably know about this, essentially about where you take the image and you blur out the surroundings to identify the main feature. So those of you who have pictures of your babies at home, those are probably bokeh images where the baby's made crystal and shiny and everything around the outside is blurry. That's essentially what they're doing. They're listening, they're surveying the land, they're quickly making sense of all of the cues and information out there to then re-engage in a more impressive way. Now, we really don't know how that's done. We know it's done. We've seen it in many different contexts, and it's something that really interests me. How do people get their bokeh on? What is happening there cognitively? So, I'm going to spend the remaining 15 minutes or so talking about how sense-making works. One of the things I'm quite interested in is, okay, I'm telling you about this process. I've hinted at some of the things that clearly make it work for experts, but what's actually going on there at a fundamental level? Surely it's not the case that two people have cylinders evolving around their head and they're choosing things from within that cylinder. It seems that there are three really interesting areas or three really interesting questions that we've addressed in this kind of literature. The first one is interpersonal sense-making a top-down or a bottom-up process? So by top-down, I mean, does an individual have a strategy in mind, a communication frame in mind, which they then channel through all of their behaviours, from their verbal behaviour, their non-verbal behaviour, and so on? Or is it actually a bottom-up process? Is there some unconscious or semi-unconscious process that allows us or helps us build a common ground from very simple units within the communication process? That's just an age-old question. The theory that you're seeing on the screen there is Simon Garrett and Martin Pickering's interaction alignment theory, which suggests actually within the brain what happens when we align representations is we align ourselves at all of these different levels of communication. The lexical, the syntactic, the semantic, and the situational model, which is in essence the cylinder. So my question is, does it go bottom-up or top-down? The emerging evidence seems to suggest actually a lot of it is bottom-up. So here you're seeing some work by Beth Richardson and colleagues where they analyse the amount of low-level language style matching or language mimicry across time in police interrogations. And what you're seeing there is two lines which tend to oppositely mirror what the stock market is doing most of the time. Two lines going across. One is related to confessions and the other is related to non-confessions. And as you can see, it ebbs and flows across time. But ultimately what's happening in the confessions is that the mimicry is that the suspect and the police interviewer are increasing their mimicry across time, increasing their language style matching. And that's predictive of a number of different outcomes across a range of different contexts. Now, what's interesting here is actually what Beth finds in particular is that what happens over time is the suspect begins to mimic more the common ground or the common understanding and the vocabulary of the police officer. In the non-confessions, there tends to be a standoff. Neither adopts the other's frame. As another example of this, we did some fairly elaborate coding of some divorce mediations, some of the most vicious conflicts you've ever seen. where we examine them at the different levels of that IAT model. So from the lexical to the syntactic, the semantic and the situational. So lexical is about do you use similar words, similar vocabulary? Syntactic, do you structure your sentences and your interactions in the same way? Semantic, are you talking about things in the same way? And situational relates to the cylinder model. And what I've done here is just give you a schematic representation of a series of graphs, demonstrating the relative importance of each of those layers to common ground and ultimate cooperation within those interactions. So time is across the bottom axis here, the amount of matching that was important for predicting common ground and cooperation on the y-axis. And what I hope you can see here is that actually the thing that's important during the first early stages of a divorce mediation interaction is lexical matching. That's the thing that predicts common ground emerging. And as we go across time, so you see the higher levels of language processing becoming more and more important to that process. So some evidence, at least, that actually, and of course it's not mutually exclusive, some evidence, at least, that there's a bottom-up process to interpersonal sense-making which complements the top-down process. Now, I think that's inevitable, because if you look at the complexities of what it's like to hold dialogue and all of the things that are going on, all of the channels that are occurring, there has to be a degree of automation to that process that allows it to happen. So that's one of the big questions in this field. A second big question in this field is what I call the multi-channel question. Of course, when we interact with people, it's not just about language. There's paralinguistic cues, there's non-verbal behaviours, there's lots of other things going on. And so one of the things that Steve Watson and I have been doing is trying to, within a virtual reality environment, is see how soldiers and others react when they are presented with what I call paradoxical situations. So when I'm verbally being really nice to you, but actually being non-verbally a bit rude. How do you make sense of that? So he's come up with some nice names. When you've got collaboration or cooperation on both of those dimensions, you've got a cooperative charmer. When we're aggressive on both of those dimensions, you've got an antagonist. But it's these two cells where there is a mishmash which becomes really interesting. You either get someone who's a bit of a creep, in other words, they're really nice to you non-verbally, but being quite verbally aggressive, or someone who's being very awkward. Now that's interesting from a channel perspective, because which of the two, non-verbal or verbal, takes priority? Which is the one that drives our understanding more than the other? And it turns out that verbal really predicts most things that happen, but non-verbal moderates that pattern. Another area where NDM researchers should be particularly interested, in my opinion, which is multi-channel, is in relation to what I would call the disruption challenge. So there are many different ways to disrupt teams from being effective. I know many of you spend your lives researching how to make teams effective. But in the policing environment, actually, we want to take organised criminal gangs, we want to take others and disrupt them. Yes? This poster here is an illustration of that. Some of you in the room might be very familiar with that poster. It's something that used to be up in our public swimming pools. Hence the don't engage in petting in the middle right-hand column. It was something we weren't allowed to do, and are still not allowed to do in public swimming pools in England. The reason I'm showing you that is each of those different cartoons there represents a different type of disruption strategy within policing. So, for example, the one that we're most familiar with, of course, is removing a key member. Yeah, we arrest somebody. We arrest a key member of the criminal gang, and we hope that will disrupt them from any more criminal action. But there's a variety of other things that we can do. We can change the network shape by disrupting the comms. We can provide success elsewhere. Marriage is still known to be the best factor for reducing criminality. We can overload criminal gangs with information or even misinformation. We can put people undercover who spread social rumour. Lots of different things that you can do. And so we've been studying this for a number of years. What we do is we go to an outward bound centre with either experienced teams from organisations or from inexperienced teams from our students. And we get them to do outward bounds challenges, many of which you're familiar with, and we disrupt them during those challenges. and we see the impact of that disruption on their interpersonal sense-making and on their ultimate problem-solving ability. Very effective, very time-consuming research, but very interesting to see the differences. So what are some of the things that we found? So just to go back to the multi-channel nature of this, that diagram, although it's very pretty, is actually designed to reflect what I consider the multi-channels that are going on here. The top layer is really disruption efforts at the individual, the middle is disruption efforts at the group, and the bottom is disruption efforts at the network level. And then across we have, from left to right, we have disruption of identity frame, disruption of instrumental, so information overload, for example, and then disruption of relational. So what do we find? The first thing which we found across multiple studies now is removing a key member seldom works as the best disruption strategy. Isn't that odd? That's probably our most used policing strategy, give or take. It tends not to be effective. There is one exception, and it won't surprise anybody in this room, when that person has specific knowledge for task completion that no other team member has, then disruption is effective. So if that person is the only individual who knows how to build the bomb, then taking that individual out is quite effective at disruption. By contrast, the most effective strategy you're seeing on this diagram is information. Misinformation, in particular, is very, very effective at disrupting teams. And the reason for that, again, will be very familiar to people in this room. Once you have a piece of erroneous information built into your sense-making and decision process, it is very hard to take it out and go back to the beginning and start again. So it really entrains and really disrupts that process. Unusually unbalancing personalities. There's lots of literature on personality balances within teams. So do you know about trait inflation, trait inflation and trait diversity. Tends not actually to make a huge difference to the teams that we've been interested in. What does matter is changing the network shape. So if you suddenly change the nature of the communications that people are allowed to do to one another, it really impacts on their abilities to change. Related to network shape is actually changing the focus of communication. So one of the things that we found repeatedly is if you can get a team to shift from talking about instrumental factors to talking about relational factors, then they tend not to be so effective at solving the task. Because if you can shift them from stop focusing on the problem to focusing on who's leading this, who's leading that, what role have I got, is somebody respecting me and so on, then it actually takes people away from the task. The third key area, or the third thing that really matters for interpersonal sense-making, is social context. When we engage in so I've been talking a lot about interpersonal sense-making as a dyadic process, but of course many times it is not. When we engage in interpersonal sense-making in a group level, it appears we take a lot of our guidance and cues from those around us. What you're watching at the moment is a CCTV footage of what's called an area of nighttime economy, such a great euphemism, but a pub in the north of England. Every country has a claim to fame. Britain's claim to fame is that we have more CCTV cameras per person, one for every 8 or 9 people, than any other country in the world. Some people might find this invasive. As a researcher, I find it fantastic. And what we're interested in here is people's sense-making around whether or not to engage in violence. So what you'll have already noticed is, and it's deliberately fuzzy so you can't identify the individuals, what you'll notice is that there's 2 protagonists, or there's one protagonist and one potential victim in the middle of this shot, and they're arguing about whether or not they're going to beat each other up, essentially. What you'll also notice as this footage goes on is that bystanders intervene. Individuals come up, try to pull people away, try to talk them out of it, try to chat them, try to find out what's going on. And so what we were really interested in is to what extent do the social context of bystanders influence the sense-making of the protagonist? Do bystanders shape the the amount of violence impacted by the protagonist. I see you all at this point are no longer listening to me and just watching the fight, but I shall carry on talking in the benefit of time. So now, those of you who remember your Psych 101 will remember actually the traditional understanding of this area is that as the group increases, as the bystanders' numbers increases, so violence goes up. Yes, because we lose our moral inhibitions in the group, and therefore we do some horrible, horrible things to other people. And there's some compelling examples of that, such as in the prison studies and so on. There is a growing and competing area of literature, largely known as the altruistic policing literature, which suggests actually that the social group plays a large role in helping people sense make and in particular de-escalate their behaviours. I shall pause at this point to mention, in a few minutes' time, you'll see they take off their shirts. This is a ritualistic behaviour that you see in most nighttime violence interactions. They are happy to beat each other up, but they are not going to get blood on their £80 Armani shirt. So you'll see the fight was rather short. I'm sorry if that disappointed anybody. But our interest was actually around this bystander notion. Does the traditional Zimbardo idea of disambiguation of responsibility occur, or is there some altruistic policing? And so what we did is we had a set of CCTV data, and we coded that data for conciliatory and aggressive behaviours across time as a sequence again. And what we're interested in is, do third-party behaviours influence the sense-making of that antagonist? So what did we find? So we found that when the number of third-party interveners, which in our data went from 2 to 14, as that increases, so you do see slightly more escalatory violent behaviour. But that is overwhelmed by the amount of de-escalatory behaviour you see from the bystanders. In other words, the larger the group, the more de-escalatory behaviour you see from the bystanders than you do escalatory behaviour. But how does that impact on our antagonists? So this isn't as complicated as it looks. What we've got on the left-hand side there is an escalatory behaviour, so a hit, a punch, a kick, a headbutt from our protagonists, and then the 3 subsequent behaviours from bystanders and the impact that they have on the ultimate outcome of the incident. Was it a very violent and gruesome incident, or did it de-escalate to a point of only minimal violence? What you'll notice from this, and I've got another slide that summarises it more easily for you, is the red parts here, where actually what you're finding is that the determination of whether a fight increases in violence or decreases in violence tends to be at this third act phase. In other words, multiple people have to have acted before what unfolds. So what does that mean? This is an easier graph to consume. We're taking 3 acts now. There are several things that could happen in a fight environment. One is that the same bystander could intervene 3 times in a row. 1, 1, 1. A second is that one bystander could intervene twice, followed by a second bystander who intervenes once. First bystander, second bystander, first bystander. First bystander, second bystander, second bystander. First bystander, second bystander, third bystander. Okay? So here we've got 3 different people intervening. Here we only have 2, here we only have 1. And what we've graphed for you there is the amount of conciliatory and escalatory behaviour we see occurring from the protagonist after that intervention. And what do you see? When only one person intervenes, then you tend to see more escalation. When 2 people intervene, we actually see no significant differences between the amount of escalation or conciliation. When 3 separate individuals intervene, then we see more conciliation and escalation. What I would argue is happening is that our protagonist is looking around them, understanding the cues of the bystanders, who overwhelmingly are creating an environment of, no, let's de-escalate this, and that impacts on their behaviour, and they are more likely to conciliate. So social context changes the way in which individuals interact with the environment. So what I've tried to do today is really two things. I wanted to really emphasise how important I think NDM is to the law enforcement and security arena. There are some wonderful exceptions of research going on. We saw one yesterday, but I really encourage many of you to engage with some of the problem spaces we have here. And the second one is I've tried to stretch the definition of NDM in some ways and suggest actually that there are many parallels and many interesting connections with what I call interpersonal sense-making. This cartoon, of course, is really taking the mick out of what's known as the Turing Challenge. So those of you who don't know the Turing Challenge and are feeling like they could do with some pocket money, if you can get a computer to interact with a human for 5 minutes without the human realising that they're interacting with a computer compared to a human, you will win, I think it's probably $3 or $5 million now for doing so. Now, obviously, they don't just interact. You know, I can tell that's a computer. Yes, they interact in an online chat, and the idea is that over time they interact with real humans and computer, and they have to judge. And if you can get to the point where you cannot get the computer to tell, no one's ever solved this challenge. Why is that the case? Because computer scientists have developed brilliantly semantically detailed, lexically complex natural language systems which can produce the most elegant sentences. But what they have not been able to do is get computers to sense make. If you feed something sarcasm or random questioning, it can't reply in a sensible way. Interpersonal sense making is a uniquely human skill. It's something that we need to know more about within the security and law enforcement domain. So thanks very much.